Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about culture and health. A lot of intercultural communication in this one, and we're going to dig into the implications that has for healthcare and interpersonal interactions as well. So the textbook goes into a lot of detail about some specific examples of cultural differences regarding health and health communication. I want to try and get down to some more fundamental things here, including some social influence theories and some intercultural theories that can help us understand the role of culture and the nature of culture. And then we can extend that into our understanding of things like health, communication, and patient-provider interactions and our day-to-day lives. So let's get into it. First of all, what is the nature of culture? Well, this is a fun figure. This analogy is made a lot. I borrowed this figure from a different textbook. It's another health communication textbook, though. We're just trying to illustrate here that the amount of culture that we see, the surface level stuff, doesn't really represent what the whole of culture, and it's actually impossible to represent the whole of culture, but the iceberg kind of analogy is perhaps appropriate. We can see that there's only a little bit above the water, so to speak, and everything else is hidden. Another way of this has been described, this is probably one of the most popular quotes regarding culture and intercultural communication, made by a rather famous anthropologist, Edward Hall, in 1959. He says, "Culture hides much more than it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants." So not only are we largely unaware of other cultures, right? We can only see them from the surface, but we also don't stop to think about our own culture most of the time. And so whenever you do something like an unconscious bias training or anything like that, we're trying to recognize this fact that unless we stop to think about something like culture, which is fundamental and deep, we may not be aware of its influence. Now, I want to dig into some definitions of culture and think about this to set up this discussion a bit further. So that's an analogy of culture, but how do we define culture? What do we describe when we talk about culture? Well, here is the definition from our textbook. It says a set of beliefs, rules, and practices that are shared by a group of people. It's nice, concise, simple, easy to remember, and if a question comes up on the exam or quizzes, we'll work with this textbook's definition. So you can sit on that one. But I also want to introduce a different definition that I think will be useful to you as well. This one is coming from an intercultural communication textbook that I've taught from in the past that I like a lot. It says an accumulated pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors, so not so different, shared by an identifiable group of people, not so different, with a common history and verbal and nonverbal symbol system. This definition is not all that different than the one above, but it does give us a little bit more detail to work with. So let's dig into this a little bit and see what it implies for us in our understanding of culture. Now, the first thing I would like to draw to your attention in this definition is the idea of an accumulated pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors. So our textbook definition mentions values, beliefs, behaviors, something similar, practices. But I like the emphasis in this Newlip definition of it's an accumulated pattern. What does that mean? Well, it reminds us of a couple of important things. For one, it implies causation over time. Values, beliefs, and behaviors are therefore dynamic by nature. It may sound like we're stating the obvious here a little bit, but we want to recognize that culture is something that emerges through people's activities, and it shapes how we behave, but we build culture, right? It is socially constructed. And the fact that it is an accumulated pattern reminds us that culture does change over time. It is not static. It is easy and tempting to look at culture, particularly when in kind of classical approaches to culture, you look at it as this, you look at the surface and you see the patterns, you're like, oh wow, look how different this culture is. Isn't it interesting? They do this strange thing. But cultures change over time. I'm trying to think of an appropriate example here. Well, hey, at the recording of this video, Halloween was a couple days ago. When I first moved to Japan, Halloween was not a holiday celebrated by the Japanese. It was just, you know, us foreigners having Halloween parties and dressing up and having fun. But by the time I left Japan, it was a pretty huge event. Now, if you go to Japan, Halloween's a really big deal. If you go to Tokyo, there's just thousands of people in Shibuya Crossing, all dressed up in costumes and all that. Um, so now Halloween has made its way around the globe, right? It has spread from country to country due to its appeal. So anyway, maybe that's not the most profound example, but just it's something simple that can help us understand that um, cultural practices are accumulated over time and they are influenced by external factors and internal factors. So we want to keep that in mind. Perhaps a more relevant health example would be sex education. I've also had the privilege of sitting in on some Japanese classrooms. Was a teacher there in rural Japan, and over that time, I saw the approaches to sex education change. And so there are now a lot of age-appropriate sex education programs they do in school uh, from very young all the way up. Now, age-appropriate is key when it comes to something like sex education. And what is age-appropriate is going to differ in varying people's opinions. Particularly parents are going to have different opinions. In a country like Japan, where it's culturally more or less homogenous, people can pretty much agree on what is age appropriate for children. So they discuss things like, these are your private parts. We have to take very good care of them because it takes one of each in order to make babies. So we want to make sure we wash our hands after we go potty. We want to make sure we don't hit each other there, etc. So that was age appropriate for about 7-year-olds in Japan. But I thought that was rather interesting and progressive for rural Japan to be talking to 7-year-olds about sex education. So health related, cultural perspective, but it changes over time. So this is a very long way of saying that we want to recognize that culture is in fact dynamic. It's critical to our understanding of ourselves and our interactions across cultures. Next, I want to draw your attention to the idea of an identifiable group. It differs a little bit from the previous definition in saying it's just like a group of people. Okay, the only thing different here is that we're talking about an identifiable group, and well, that complicates things a little bit, right? What constitutes an identifiable group of people? We could belabor this point as well if we want to. Um, what constitutes an identifiable group? Are we talking about demographics? Are we talking about a shared love of My Little Ponies, as in the brony culture? Are we talking about values, politics, something that can change, something that can't change? If you want to go back to like master identities, well, it could be any of these things. And at the very least, I want us to recognize that in terms of an identifiable group, uh, depending on the context, that could be identified from within the group or without the group, usually a combination of both. But remember, identity comes in many forms. There's ascribed identity and there's avowed identity. There's how we think of ourselves, that's avowed identity. And there's ascribed identity, which is coming from outside, how society views that particular group. Both are going to influence culture. Some are going to influence how culture is seen, but we also respond to how our group is viewed and shape our culture in that way as well. History. Sharing a common history. Uh, this is lived experience. Shared lived experience shapes perceptions and it increases the coherence of the group. Um, Terms used to describe this might be in evolutionary psychology, they say co-registration of experience, of conspecifics. They have lots of fancy terms for this, right? To describe how social animals growing together, living together, establish norms beyond just what is hereditarily acceptable. They also, evolutionary psychologists, they do talk about things like how morality and sociality is in fact evolved and it has some predispositions. But when we're talking about culture, it's not, culture is not expressed chromosomally, right? It's not hereditary. It's not just our DNA expressing itself. It is our nature, which is hereditary, our nature expressing itself in a unique environment and context. So that's another one you can take to the bank, right? So culture is the expression of our nature in a specific context. And so shared history, lived experience, that is a big part of this as well. That increases group cohesion, among other things. Another term for this is co-orientation. as described in interpersonal literature, talking about family units, for instance. You have a lot more in common with if you have a sibling, you have a lot more in common with your sibling than you do with your friends, whether or not you like them more, just because of having grown up in similar places, in the same house, under the same parents, eating the same food, moving around the same ways, following the same patterns. That's all co-orientation. Anyway, lived experience shapes our perceptions, and this is a critical part of culture, is a shared history. A symbol system, verbal and nonverbal symbol system. We're talking about the way in which we communicate. And as communication people, this is important. And so this is probably one of the things I like most about this definition, is it brings in this factor of a verbal and nonverbal symbol system, recognizing that we have both the shared history, but we also share a means of exchanging information. So a symbol system is a means of efficiently communicating meaning. This isn't just words. It's an exchange of encoding and decoding messages and meaning. Right? We do not transmit information telepathically. We have to communicate it. That is part of what makes us so interesting as social animals, is the complexity of our symbol systems. We have both verbal or literal meaning of the words that we say. We also have nonverbal communication, which is usually more signal than symbol, right? So if you've studied nonverbal at all, we usually describe a symbol as something arbitrary used to represent something concrete. Right? A letter is arbitrary, but it has a specific meaning. That's a symbol. A signal, such as a grimace or a smile, that might be more natural and have an associated meaning that is more directly associated with the signal. So in this sense, the symbol system might involve both, because we're talking about verbal and nonverbals. So do you literally speak the same language? Are you speaking across languages, a language barrier? Even if you're speaking the same language and you're speaking your second language, that makes a huge difference too. When I speak Japanese, I sound like equal parts middle schooler and very much American. Like I will never lose my accent because I didn't start learning that language until my 20s. So when I speak Japanese, I'm able to communicate pretty effectively, but it's not the same as being a Japanese person. Likewise with the nonverbal communication. Eye contact is sometimes seen as indecent in some cultures. And so if I'm staring at someone in the face, even in Japanese culture, that could be perceived as threatening. Animals do this too, right? If we stare at a bird in the eyes, they will freak out because they think you're going to eat them. So I don't know, that's a very strange example, I know, but if you ever work with birds of prey, don't look them in the eyes. Same with monkeys, same with most animals. If you stare in their eyes, they interpret that as a threat. That's a signal. It's a nonverbal thing. But culture modifies how we interpret those signals, whether it be a smile or eye contact or a grimace, whatever it is. That is managed by culture. And so nonverbal communication is not always going to be interpreted the same way, even if it has natural roots, so to speak. So here's a model coming from that same intercultural textbook, just kind of illustrating how communication interactions occur, intercultural communication or interactions occur. This looks more complicated than it is. All we're trying to illustrate here is that there are embedded contexts. You have the overarching culture, say America or Japan. You have the microculture, maybe it's in the educational environment, maybe it's in the classroom, maybe it's in a bar. That makes it different. Well, that's more of the environment, but microculture, what kind of part of this culture are you exposed to? Is it in a professional context? Is it in a public place? Is it a library? The environment bleeds into that a little bit, of course, because how does the environment itself shape the interaction? It could be the color of the paint on the walls, the temperature in the room. It could be the amount of space in between the interactants. There isn't a whole lot of space in Japan. 85% of the country is mountains. So accordingly, all their construction, their roads, their buildings, their rooms, their layout of those rooms is extending out of that environmental reality, that geographic reality, and that shapes those interactions. I'm over 6 feet tall. I walked into a lot of doorways in Japan because they're just not that tall. It's a cliche, I know, but it's true, right? So how does that environment shape your interaction? We have a lot of space in the United States. We have big rooms. My office is only slightly smaller than some apartments in Japan. Um, do I need all that space? Not necessarily, but if you're used to that amount of space and you go to a different country where there's less space and you're having conversations there, you might feel a little claustrophobic, or vice versa. I remember talking to Japanese friends who have been in America, and they invariably said something in Japanese that translates directly to, wow, the sky is so broad, right? Because there's no mountains on the horizon in Wisconsin. Um, so environment shapes those interactions as well. But within all that, you have the individuals, the perceptions of individual A, and the perceptions of individual B. They interact with a nonverbal and verbal system and have socio-relational context as well in terms of what kind of relationships might exist between them and their respective groups. So all that really matters here is that we want to recognize the complexity of the communication environment. Particularly, this is not all that different than any communication. But many instances of communication are, in fact, intercultural, because you don't have to be from a different country to have a different culture. You could come from, if you talk to someone from Milwaukee versus Madison or Walworth County, there are different cultural norms there as well. And sometimes you see greater cultural divides across urban and rural boundaries than you do across national boundaries. So think about that. But at any rate, all communication interactions experience this level of complexity. But when it's an intercultural interaction, the complexity is more complex. Maybe that's the simplest way to say it. So we just want to keep that in mind, that we may be masters of our own culture, even though we don't understand everything that's going on below the surface. However, we cannot assume that people from a different culture are going to have shared understandings of everything that we're talking about. Now, this brings us to kind of where the textbook begins, and they talk about ethnocentrism. Whenever we talk about culture and cultural differences, people tend to have a couple of responses. Either you say, wow, that's weird, our culture is way better, or, oh, look how interesting this culture is, and you romanticize it. We do both, obviously, and we want to be aware of the pitfalls of both. Neither is like evil, okay? Anytime we hear the word ethnocentrism, people often assume that this means that people are like racist and evil. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about when we say the word ethnocentrism is it's the tendency to view one's own culture as innately superior to others. Pretty much everyone's ethnocentric, just by nature of you're born and raised in a specific culture. Now, when you bring ethnocentrism into an intercultural interaction, that can lead to some conflicts and misunderstandings. And so as soon as we start interacting across cultures, we are faced with our own culture as well. And then we have to think about things that we like about our own culture and things we don't like about our own culture, things we like about the other culture, things we don't like about the other culture. But that takes a certain level of kind of emotional maturity, which leads us to this idea of the reflective negotiation model. The textbook raises this as an example of well, this is an example specific to healthcare, right? Because we had a specific doctor who's like, well, I want to work on this, right? And so all we're really saying here is that we should be culturally mindful. So that requires self-awareness as well as cultural sensitivity. So reflecting on our own culture. Why do I do this thing? That's interesting. They do it differently. Cultural sensitivity would be acknowledging that other people are going to probably have different ways of doing things and then trying to engage with that. Now, the goal of this kind of model is to foster a more collaborative space in healthcare settings, but the same principles apply to any intercultural interaction. The goal is that somewhere between thinking about your own reactions and thinking about why other people seem to do things differently, that can create a more collaborative space between the doctor and patient, for instance, but also it can create this kind of internal tension that can allow us to be more mindful of culture and how it operates. So when it comes to most cultural interactions, step one is ask yourself what you're feeling and why. And then you can go from there. You don't have to like everything about a different culture. You don't have to like anything about a different culture. You can still come to the conclusion that your culture is the best, and that's fine. But we do want to have a certain level of reflectiveness and mindfulness that can help us through intercultural interactions, particularly in like a healthcare setting, because if you are not aware of those differences and you're not engaging with them, that's going to be a problem for you. Anytime I talk about culture and cultural differences, I like to bring up this example. This is um, a body of research that looks at cultural values as shared rather than different, because one of the knee-jerk reactions to studying culture is to categorically list all these differences between your culture and my culture. And that also, while that leads to ethnocentrism and things like that sometimes, well, the cure to that is not just respecting cultural differences, but trying to figure out what we have in common. And that's what I like about Shalom Schwartz's work of the 10 universal values. He investigated, essentially this is survey work where he went to a bunch of different countries and administered surveys and asked people to rank these different values and say, how important are these things to you? It's a little more complicated than that, but that's enough for our understanding here. But what I think is most interesting about this is that people tended to answer in certain patterns. And so no matter what country you went to, for the most part, on average, people ranked these top three values in the top three, not always in this order, but in the top three, and these bottom two values in the bottom two, not always in that order, but that was fairly consistent. Not every single time, but enough that Schwartz says, well, that's interesting. People seem to share these values. And that is fascinating. As for the middle ones here, achievement, hedonism, security, conformity, tradition, I think that there's two possible explanations as to why these might be less consistent. Like they're kind of all over the place there. Either one, each culture has very different understanding as to what these terms mean and how important they are, or two, they're just expressions of the other more universal values, perhaps more removed or more expressed through the culture. Could be that too, or it could just be a problem with the survey, that the definitions didn't quite stick with people. But for whatever reason, those middle five ones were not as salient to people as those other five. But the point here is that anytime we're thinking about culture, it doesn't really do us as much good to just focus on what we don't have in common. We need to recognize that there are things that we do have in common. We're all humans, we're not space aliens, and we have a lot in common. And our cultures may look different on the surface, but what's down at the bottom of that iceberg might be quite similar after all. I want to take just a moment here to touch on another aspect of intercultural communication you may be familiar with, and that is culture shock. You've probably heard this term before. It refers to the experience people have when they move to a different culture. And so there are multiple stages here. Honestly, I think that this pattern is similar to any major life event. Anytime there's like marriage or death or even moving, going to college, right? You probably will experience a similar thing here. But it's worth thinking about this process for a moment in relation to the current discussion, because it is another reminder that culture doesn't just change over time for like large groups, it also changes for individuals based on their individual experience. So what culture shock, the U curve of cultural adjustment looks something like this, right? The first month or so, you're in the honeymoon period, you move to a new country. Wow, look how different this is. It's really interesting. Oh, all this interesting food. Cool, they do that? Weird. But then after a while, culture shock sinks in. And that can be very stressful, like debilitatingly stressful. Like some people kill themselves stressful. I remember when I first went to Japan and we were doing our orientation in Tokyo, we were all there in our honeymoon phase in like the first couple days, having fun, drinking beer, singing karaoke. And then at some panel, some guy let slide the number of participants in that program that killed themselves every year. And we're all like, whoa, what? We did not, it wasn't something that was on our radar until that moment. And I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was enough that I was like, okay. And it's stressful, right? So, and then when we went off to our respective parts of the country, we got to experience culture shock firsthand, and it can be very scary when you are far from home, no way to get back. The language is different, the letters are different, the architecture is different, you're banging your head on doorways. It can be incredibly stressful when you go to a different culture. Usually people adjust though, and there are things that help that. Um, I think number one is getting involved in the community, which I'll discuss in the next slide. But ultimately, eventually, people adjust quite a bit and they achieve a new level of balance, right? They move past the ethnocentrism, they move past the romanticizing the other culture, and they get to a point where they say, well, this is what I like about this culture, this is what I like about my culture, and I am a unique individual here living my life. And that usually happens. It happens at different amounts of time for different people. But what we want to recognize here is that people are not always stuck where they're at. We can draw out these periods of culture shock, of cultural adjustment, including culture shock, if we don't have healthy behaviors. So let's talk about some healthy behaviors that can help with that. But again, the reason I think this matters is because if you are, for instance, in a healthcare interaction or just any interaction interculturally, and you meet someone, you should probably recognize that they might be at one or more of these different stages of adjustment. Just because they're acting a certain way now doesn't mean they're going to be that way forever. The textbook has lots of examples of expats and foreigners and travelers in the U.S. healthcare system and acting a certain way that is really hard for the providers, for instance, and their family members are there, and there's all these tensions and conflicts. But I'm just trying to point out to you that it would help those providers if they recognize that they're dealing with people in stressful situations sometimes. They may not be at that whole cultural mastery level. Maybe they just got there. Maybe they're still struggling with the culture. And so that can maybe help us give a little bit of a benefit of the doubt to people that we interact with in intercultural interactions. And perhaps this can help us with audience segmentation as well, incidentally, because we're going to wrap up this lecture when we get to it, talking about the implications for our health programs, right? So for audience segmentation, if we've got a cultural aspect, this is another way in which that audience might be at a different level of okayness with the message. But getting back to the topic of culture shock here, there are a lot of things that you can do to avoid it or improve it. I'm not going to spend too much time on this page other than to point out in this figure here that there are many factors that influence cultural adaptation, such as the predisposition of the individual, the environment in which they are situated, and their interactions with the community. Here on this slide, I've got a couple pictures from my own life. One of the things that helped me when I lived in rural Japan and no one spoke English and I was really struggling was getting involved in the community. And so this was a local taiko group. Taiko is these big war drums you see there, and it was a drum ensemble, and we did a lot of cool pieces. I was performing regularly with them for about 2 years, and anytime I go back, I try to go say hi to everyone and practice a little bit. But that was critical for my cultural adaptation when I was in Japan, in terms of it helped my Japanese language ability, because these were all community members. None of them spoke English, really. They were all involved with different aspects of the community. This was like fishermen, and politicians, and butchers, and teachers, and everything in between. It added structure to my life. It added social interaction, and all of these things help with the intercultural transformation in terms of your psychological health, your intercultural identity, and your functional fitness. So regardless of where you find yourself, do your best to do something. Do anything. Get involved in the community, make friends, because the worst thing you can do for culture shock is to become a shut-in, hide in your apartment, and just binge Netflix all the time. You got to get out, you got to do stuff. And this applies to everyday life too. I mean, you don't have to go to Japan to experience this. If you find you're suffering from something like depression and you're stuck inside, these kinds of things can help. Getting out of your house, getting involved, doing things, it can help a lot for adjustment. But this is all the more important if you find yourself in a stressful cultural situation. So let's keep that in mind too as we go forward and try to give benefit of the doubt to people who are in stressful healthcare situations and trying to figure out how to move forward. Now, one last figure for you here. This is coming from a textbook called Managing Diversity. So this is a workplace diversity textbook, and it's talking about the barriers to effective cross-cultural communication. Now, we don't need to spend too much time on this. Again, we have someone who encodes a message, They transmit it to someone who decodes the message. This is a simple transmission model. We know communication is more complicated than that, but what we really want to focus on here are the cultural barriers, right? We have nonverbal barriers, which we mentioned before, in which people have difficulty interpreting cues across culture. Remember our discussion of representation in healthcare and the problem with pain management in African Americans or Black Americans here in the United States. That problem with the pain medications being prescribed or not seems to be more of a cultural issue. This is what we're talking about here, nonverbal barriers. It may not seem like that's a different cultural group, but there are cultural differences, and that can be enough to make it difficult for the doctors to understand what those people are truly experiencing, and vice versa. We also have verbal barriers, whether it's vocabulary, idioms, or expressions. If we use figures of speech a lot, people need cultural context to understand that. Emphasis, enunciation, accent, all of these things I've already mentioned before, but just remember the complexity of this environment, and these are barriers to effective cross-cultural communication as well. So we can do things to minimize that. We can limit our use of expressions and idioms. We can try to be sensitive to differences in nonverbal communication, maybe not touch people so much, whatever it may be, give them space if they're kind of indicating that they need more space. There are ways to work around these barriers, but the first step is to recognize that they exist. Now, the textbook also brings in, much like the discussion of the voice of the life world versus the voice of medicine, that there are different views of health. Medical models consider health to be an absence of symptoms of illness. But we can already see that that doesn't work all the time. That doesn't really work with, for instance, the WHO definition, which was describing that it's a combination of emotional, physical, psychological, social well-being. Obviously, a cultural perspective of health is a bit more nuanced, and many cultures have spirituality tied up in health. We do too, make no mistake. But the role of balance is hugely important in different cultures, such as, for example, qi and the yin and yang thing and the hot and cold. The textbook goes into great detail about this, so I'm not going to dig too far into it, other than to recognize that there are different cultural understandings of health, and we need to be aware of that, not just for the intercultural communication barriers, but also for the way that these factors manifest. So there are cultural dilemmas, and the textbook mentions some of those as well, right? If for instance, if in Hmong culture, they may view something like a seizure as a communication with the divine, for instance. And they're not the only ones, obviously. But using that as an example, that's problematic from a healthcare perspective because those individuals may be less inclined to follow the prescribed health action, such as taking anti-seizure meds or something like that. Well, that's tricky. So how do we deal with this? We want to recognize that there are different conceptions, and that doesn't mean that if you're like a medical doctor in the West, you have to totally believe in acupuncture or anything like that. But we need to recognize that that's people's worldview. That's how they view health and illness in terms of balance, often hot and cold, and we can often work within those models. Again, the textbook mentions something like, well, if the individual does not want to drink a cold drink because they think that they have a cold condition, you could always offer them tea, right? There are simple solutions to these problems, but in order to reach those solutions, we need to recognize the barriers and we have to be sensitive to those cultural differences. So it's probably a good time for us to take another step back and just recognize how many different factors influence our conception of health. That could be our ethnicity, it could be our age, it could be our sex or gender, probably more gender than sex, and we'll get into that in a moment. It could be our socioeconomic conditions, it could be geography. There's a lot of things that feed into it. Using geography as an example, again, I already mentioned how that can affect the constructed environment, such as in Japan, but we could, and I know I use a lot of Japan examples because I lived there for 3 years and that's like what I know. But we can also think about how geography extends up to health and how it is expressed and how it is considered. It may not seem like it, right? You might be thinking, oh, national boundaries or, I don't know, trees. Yes, all of these things do influence that, but how it feeds into culture and how we live our lives and experience health is part of this as well. So if you're Baths. I love using this as an example. We have this conception about like Victorian England where no one took baths. Not totally true, but they probably took baths less frequently than the Japanese. Why might that be? Throughout Japanese history, taking a bath has been basically ritual. Daily bathing was not unusual. It was encouraged and it was always associated with good health. Well, part of that might be because Japan is a volcano. The whole island is volcanic. It is an island chain. It sits on the boundary of two tectonic plates, and there's a lot of volcanic activity. Therefore, there's a lot of hot springs. You've probably seen the pictures of monkeys bathing in hot springs in Nagano or Nagoya. I'm not sure which city. Um, but even the monkeys like to sit in the hot springs. So if you're in an area that has hot springs and you have access to that kind of bath all the time, well, that might feed into your culture a little bit, right? It's very easy to take baths. And so that is part of the culture all the way up to how it's expressed now. And daily bathing is recognized. Every night people bathe before they go to bed. That's pretty typical, right? So, man, I miss hot springs. They're really great. If you get a chance to go ahead. But we can see that that is feeding up all the way from the geography in terms of what is beneath the very feet of the people living in that country. And it feeds all the way up to what resources are available to them, how they engage with those resources and culture. And then it in turn feeds into and expresses as taboos and stigmas in terms of, have you taken a bath today? Well, we've got a hot spring right over there. What's your problem, right? So we can see that even something like geography feeds into how we think about health and illness. Now let's dig into the can of worms that is gender and health. Um, we can compare gender roles and keeping in mind that this is a gross overgeneralization and also keeping in mind that when we look at anything based on categorical differences such as demographics, we run the risk of stereotyping. But this table is reflecting some documented trends in the United States in terms of gender roles. Now, before we get into all this, I want to mention a couple of things. One, when we talk about gender roles, well, gender is cultural. If we distinguish between sex and gender, as is the norm, right? We're talking about biological sex as the expression of chromosomes in terms of whether or not you're female or male, right? We are a sexually dimorphous species. We can see real biological differences there, such as differences in upper body strength, and differences in fat deposits, differences in bone density, right? We're a sexually dimorphous species. However, in every cultural context, those sex roles manifest and express differently. So this is actually a perfect example of what we're talking about, right? There is the natural, natural in the sense of like what is in our human nature as animals, but the culture influences how that is expressed. That's a gender role. So gender roles are associated with biological sex in the sense that each culture has its expectations for the sexes. Those expectations are gender roles, right? So what happens then? These are largely associated in most cultures with our basic sexual dimorphism. So for instance, males of the species cannot generate other human beings, right? We can't grow babies, right? Without a womb, you can't grow babies. So those gender roles over time have been mostly associated with, centered on that fact that the females are the ones that are generating babies, and therefore the caregiver role is kind of projected on that side of the species, whereas the males have more body strength and are not generating other human beings. So combat roles and providing and protectors, well, in that sense, that this is more of an evolutionary perspective, but that's helpful for us to understand that culture is responding just like we respond to geography. We respond to those the innate sexual dimorphism of the species. However, gender roles can be expressed rather arbitrarily. Like there's nothing universal about women wearing dresses, right? That's whatever. You can go to some cultures where it's more normal for men to wear dresses. The gender role, that's modified by the culture. But the fact that we have gender roles, that's usually projected on the sexes, right? So we can look at gender roles as an expression of culture and see how the cultures treat each gender, each sex, and what that looks like. Now, so this table is just designed to kind of illustrate that the gender role often attributed to each individual sex would be women as caregivers, men as protectors or providers, combatants. That is consistent with American culture as well, right? We see that here as well as many other different cultures. And so we have other expectations in terms of how society decides we should view roles of vulnerability, for instance. Women are expected to be more sensitive and empathetic as associated with the caregiver role. Men are expected to be more strong and resilient and have emotional restraint as associated with combat roles. Uh, and then this is reflected in terms of employment. We do see this expressed in employment trends, whether it's military or STEM fields, social support, education. Women tend to favor more education roles, men tend to favor more STEM roles. But you can also see it's starting to get a little bit of a stretch there, right? There's probably nothing innate so profound about men and women that one is so suited to one role or another. There's some evidence that there's some predisposition in terms of women have better communication between the right and left hemispheres of their brain, et cetera, et cetera. But like, how much does that really matter in terms of these things? Probably not as much as culture does, right? So it could very well be learned behavior projected on these individual gender roles rather than species. That nature versus nurture question comes up all the time, and we can argue about it till the cows come home, speaking of idioms. But what matters for our discussion here is recognizing that there are expectations placed on each sex in the form of gender roles. Now, but what does that mean for health, right? Well, for health considerations, there are health considerations in terms of whether or not you are predisposed to prostate cancer or ovarian cancer. Both sexes are susceptible to breast cancer, but women are more susceptible, probably just because there's usually more breast tissue there. But there are other health considerations as well. Um, they may be more social. They may be more cultural. Women are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from PTSD, from traumatic events. Men are 4 times more likely to die by murder or suicide. They're also more likely to be diagnosed with or suffer from ADHD. How much of this is social? How much of this is natural? Well, that question is probably less meaningful than what we can do about it. And so the question is only as meaningful as it helps us deal with those problems, right? If there was something innate, then that would be one thing. But these problems are probably mostly cultural. Now, the other thing is the leading cause of death for Americans, whether they're men or women, is heart disease, right? So is it really super meaningful to focus on the sex or gender? Not necessarily, but it may be more helpful for us to recognize that gender roles come along with a whole lot of assumptions, a whole lot of expectations, and a whole lot of pressures in terms of how we behave and act. And so that we need to be aware of, particularly if you are a healthcare provider making those assumptions about those individuals. I think at the end of the day, what we learn from all this is that you got to deal with the people who are in front of you, not their demographics. The demographics can help us for things like audience segmentation and who we're targeting health interventions at. But at the individual level, we want to deal with the individuals. Above that, we can start using some of these demographic trends to better tailor our campaigns, but we still have to always guard against doing these gross overgeneralizations and stereotypes. I know I'm talking in circles, aren't I? Because I'm doing some overgeneralizations and stereotyping, but saying that we can't really use that and we have to guard against it. We can use it at these larger levels to help observe and respond to trends. But when it comes to healthcare and when it comes to individualized healthcare, there's no substitute for dealing with the individual. But nevertheless, you can see how something like gender as an expression of the culture, regardless of its nature or nurture roots, it affects how we view healthcare, how we treat people, and how we treat them for illness. So we want to keep those things in mind as well. Not to impose these roles further on people or unfairly categorize people, but to give better care, more targeted care, and more successful care in the long run. Now, speaking of using demographic trends at the larger level, this is Uh, And there are a lot of considerations in terms of doing this ethically. Again, we always want to guard against just stereotyping people, and we also want to recognize that culture changes over time. But in terms of making successful health campaigns and programs, which will be relevant to your final projects, we want to be aware that part of audience segmentation is a consideration of culture. And so we need to be able to take many different perspectives into account to be effective in our health interventions. The messages are always, as with all persuasive messaging, audience-centered. But it needs to go a little bit further than that in health communication. We need to think about the roles of taboo and stigma, how those are associated with things like cultural differences and gender roles, indeed. Um, and we have to think about how cultural sensitivity can feed into a strategy, can influence a strategy. And so these are some of the considerations that we have to look at here. Let's dig into it. Cultural competence is the name of the game. When we hear this word, this phrase, it usually means something specific. It means something specific at different levels too, right? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines cultural competence as the capacity to function effectively as an individual and an organization within the context of cultural beliefs, behaviors, and needs presented by consumers and their communities. That's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, this is coming from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so they're interested in both public health interventions, those macro interventions. They're also interested in micro level interventions such as patient-provider communication. Excuse me. So whether you're an individual or the federal government or an organization trying to make a public health intervention, we're talking about the capacity to function effectively in that environment. So that means being able to respond to and be sensitive to those cultural beliefs, whether it's the spirituality associated with communing with the divine, or whether it is assumptions about God's will, or whether it is specific needs of that community, what they want done. And with most cultural interventions or health interventions, when we talk about cultural sensitivity, we're not just talking about like accomplishing a strict goal, like eliminating malaria in a population. That may be what's important to me as a health official. However, that may not be the biggest concern for those people in that population. Maybe they're more interested in food sustainability, clean water, or just protecting the elderly before they protect their children who are more susceptible to malaria. And cultural competence means you have to be responsive to that. Sometimes you may have to help them with the thing that they need before you can get the thing that they want, before you can help them get the thing that they need, as an example. But that might be what cultural competence looks like in that context. So we need to have an understanding of the beliefs, and we have to have an understanding of what they need, what they want in that community, in that group. So well-designed and well-executed health communication plans are going to rely on an in-depth understanding of those intended audiences. Again, audience-centered messaging, and that has a need for audience segmentation, including, among other things, their readiness to accept a message, we could think about it again in terms of the U curve of acculturation, whether they are on the upswing of that, they've gone through their culture shock and now they're adjusting to their new environment. That could be part of this as well. But it also has to be tailored to their needs and their beliefs. So what do they believe? Not what you believe. That's part of it. But when we have a well-designed and well-executed health communication plan, it's going to be responsive to the things that that target audience needs and what they believe. We should have group-specific messages, channels, and messengers. So this is, again, going back to that audience-specific messaging. We don't want to come off as tone deaf or patronizing. And we want to make sure that we're using channels that that audience is going to be exposed to. And we want to use messengers that perhaps are part of the community, gatekeepers, stakeholders. And this is why most of these health interventions are really striving to involve the community, because it's one thing for a white researcher to go to, whatever population and tell them what they need. But it's a totally different thing to work with that population to address what they want and need. Because even if you are right, going all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we were discussing health messaging and coercion and lying, even if you're right, it doesn't matter if they're not going to respond to that message and enact the behavior that you want. And that's more likely to happen if you do not seem to be, if you don't seem to be, and you're not interested in representing the needs of that community. So it should also include a good well-designed health communication plan should include considerations for capacity building. So again, we want to avoid this problem of what has been referred to as helicopter research, where you have a researcher come in, sometimes literally from a helicopter, and study this indigenous population. They get a paper out of it and they leave. But that doesn't help that community. And so most of these health communication plans are really, we're trying to keep, even though it sounds like it's stating the obvious, we're trying to keep the goal of helping that community in our forefront. And that includes having capacity building, whether it's building infrastructure or enhancing the relationships between doctors and their patients. It's going to take us a minute here to just consider some persuasion and social influence theories, because these things are related to strategic communication as well, including health communication interventions. So just briefly, all I really want to talk about here is that there are a couple of different ways in which we interpret persuasive messaging. Usually, scholars who are interested in this are interested in two routes of persuasion or different kinds of evidence. This is coming from the elaboration likelihood model and the health belief model, things like that. But these different routes are, well, one is the heuristic route, which is also known as the peripheral route of persuasion. This kind of evidence is more like cues, rather than thinking through or engaging with the message itself, the content of the message. So think the attractiveness of the speaker, the credibility, their credentials, the aesthetics of the message. Is it colorful? Is it edgy? Does it have good music? Is it a video? Is it digestible? So this might have more to do with the channels than the content of the message, right? We refer to this as heuristic because heuristics are like devices that don't require us to think too much. We also have the systematic route of persuasion, also known as the central route of persuasion and elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model, I've mentioned that a couple times. All that means is how likely is the individual receiving the message to elaborate on it in their head. That means think about it, engage with the content. People are more likely to do this when they have high involvement with the message, but appealing to that would be using logic and rationality, such as formal logic, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A probably equals C too. Obviously an oversimplification, but hey, that's the way it goes. Now, we want to keep in mind that nothing is truly rational. There are all sorts of cognitive programs and shortcuts that our brains take to process information. But the main goal here that we're taking away from social influence is to recognize that there are multiple routes of persuasion. We can have heuristic cues, we can have systematic cues or content-related cues, and we can have both. We would call that parallel processing. If you care enough, the elaboration likelihood model states that if someone is engaging with a message on the systematic side of things or through the central route, they're more likely to have lasting behavior change. But a lot of people argue that, and there's mixed evidence for that. And so when it comes to effective health campaigns, you should leverage both. You should leverage parallel processing. You should have good aesthetic cues that are culturally situated, and you should have good systematic cues that are related to good content, good information, but also information that they can actually process and digest, something that is on their level, not just like impressive, right? The information's for them, not for your ego or whatever it may be. But parallel processing involves both routes. So, and culturally situated as we can manage. Here's an example. We've probably looked at this before too. This is a fish consumption app designed for the Great Lakes Anishinaabe. That is the Chippewa tribe, primarily situated around the Great Lakes in North America. So this app is designed to give people tailored advice, individualized medical advice in terms of what fish they can safely consume and in what amounts. So we can see some aspects of both cues here, both routes of persuasion. You see lots of technical information, but it's situated. You also see aesthetic information. The app looks professional, it looks nice. You have artistic renditions, realistic and stylized renditions of the fish. The stylized rendition is done in the woodland style that is familiar to the Anishinaabe community. There, some famous artists within that community that paint in this style. And you have information that is specifically tailored to the individual. Fish consumption is another area in which there is stratified risk, in the sense that primarily our biggest concern with fish consumption is that developing fetuses are more sensitive to environmental contaminants than adults. So me, as an adult who does not have to grow any other human beings inside of me, I can eat a lot more fish without having any problems. I can still get acute mercury poisoning, but I can get acute mercury poisoning a lot less easily than a embryo can that is within, say, a pregnant woman who's eating a lot of fish high up in the food chain that have a lot of methylmercury in them. That can be very dangerous. And so these fish consumption advisories are designed to avoid a illness known as Minamata disease, named after a Japanese village that got just slammed with contaminants from a chemical factory that was just dumping methylmercury into the river. And so it's a very sad story. But that's why we have things like fish consumption advisory. We don't want people to stop eating fish, but we want them to make better, responsible choices. Since the Anishinaabe are a subsistence fishing culture, then this is meant to be a tailored approach to that. We have multiple routes of persuasion. We have a consideration of the cultural context in terms of socio-political context and the fact that this is a subsistence fishing village, but it's also, this whole project is recognizing the fact that the Native American tribes may not be super trusting of the federal government for very good reason. This app is developed by the Native American Research Centers for Health in Lac du Flambeau, Wisconsin. That is a Native American Research Center for Health. The people who helped develop the app, there were, of course, other, Western or white researchers who are not tribal members, but it is embedded in the community, it is culturally sensitive, and it is working with the community to address their needs, including the use of gatekeepers. Many of the people involved in the project were tribal members, right? They are involved in the community. So essentially what we're talking about here is having to move beyond a simple transmission model of communication and understanding that it goes a little deeper than just saying, here's the technical information, make the right choice for your health. That model has been obsolete for about 60 years now, and we are moving in more directions like this, cultural relevance of health interventions. That's kind of a long explanation, but hopefully you now have a better understanding of how culture works and intercultural communication in health communication.